Good morning and welcome to our concluding presentation recognizing Hispanic Heritage Month here at McGuire Woods. Welcome to Tom Saenz, President and General Counsel of the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, MALDEF. Tom, thank you very, very much for being here with us today. Thank you to all of you who have taken some time today on this Friday to be with us, to recognize Hispanic, Latinx heritage. A very special welcome to our clients, a warm welcome to John Harmon, our chairman, and to Ava Elias-Booker, my partner and chair of our diversity committee here at McGuire Woods. Today's program, Tom Saenz will speak for about the first half hour or so, and then we'll open up the floor to questions. You'll have a couple of ways to submit your questions. You can raise your hand using the icon on your WebEx screen, or you can write out your question also using WebEx and send it in to me, and I can read it aloud. So let's begin today, whether you're on the West Coast this morning or on the East Coast this afternoon. And let's begin with a purpose in mind, a goal together that we'll share for the next hour. Let me offer that it might be a goal to learn, to understand, and to appreciate one another, to appreciate Latino heritage within the context of the struggle for civil rights and for social justice. We may not always agree, and there may be issues raised during Tom's talk with us today, but as my favorite person taught us, we should seek to be understood as well as to understand. That was St. Francis, for those who don't recognize the words. Tom Saenz, President and General Counsel of MALDEF, one of our country's most effective, long-term, committed and passionate civil rights leaders. Someone who, since graduating from Yale and Yale Law School, has committed his entire life to helping Latinos in courtrooms across America, including in the Supreme Court of the United States, in the halls of Congress, in city halls, including in the city of Los Angeles, where he helped to lead Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa's administration, and in so many state houses throughout the United States. Tom's focus, equal justice under law for all people. MALDEF, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, founded in 1968 in San Antonio, Texas. Inspired by the civil rights era legal battles mounted on behalf of African Americans and the pervasive discrimination experienced by Latinos in the United States. Over the course of more than 50 years, MALDEF has achieved legal victories and designed laws that have led to greater social justice in our country. And there's much work to be done, as you'll hear today from Tom. But through it all, MALDEF has earned, and Tom has earned, their reputations as both the civil rights law firm for the Latino community and the civil rights litigator and leader as it relates to Latinos in the United States. And so I am honored. We at McGuire Woods are honored to welcome Tom Saenz, President and General Counsel to MALDEF, the civil rights law firm to the Latino community. Good morning, Tom.
Good morning, Greg. Thank you very much for your generous introduction. And thank you and McGuire Woods for including me in your commemoration this year of Hispanic Heritage Month. And thank you, Greg, for your long-standing support for the civil rights cause and specifically for MALDEF. Thank you all for joining us this morning. I will begin by telling you a bit more about MALDEF and some of the focus that we have today in what is for all of us an unprecedented year of challenges, not just created by the pandemic itself, but certainly by the economic recession that it catalyzed. And also we have been affected, of course, by the reinvigoration through demonstrations across the country and statements of support from corporate America and virtually every sector of society for the reinvigorated Black Lives Matter movement. But I want to start with some history. As you've heard from Greg, MALDEF recently commemorated our 50th anniversary. We opened our doors in 1968 in San Antonio, Texas, which began as our headquarters. The very same month, we opened another office in Los Angeles, California, which is now our national headquarters. In 1968, 52 years ago, a group of lawyers, community leaders from primarily the Mexican-American community in the southwest part of the United States concluded together that the Latino community needed an equivalent of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, which a little over a decade earlier had achieved the monumental victory in Brown versus Board of Education. After MALDEF's founding, our lead founder, a Texas lawyer by the name of Pete Tijerina, would tell the story of what inspired him to put together the group that became the founders of MALDEF. And he recounted a story of a client, a Latina woman who had been grievously injured due to the negligence of a large company. And he realized that she was entitled to a substantial recovery. But he also realized that even then, in the mid-1960s, in South Texas, despite a significant Mexican-American population, no Mexican-Americans were allowed to sit on juries. These were only white juries that would hear cases both civil and criminal. And he concluded that his client would not receive the recovery that she deserved if she had an all-white jury hearing her case. So as Tijerina later described it, he went before the judge and made an impassioned argument to address this ongoing constitutional violation of jury exclusion. As he recounted it, the judge paid attention and promised that if Mr. Tijerina returned with his client a few weeks later, that he, the judge, and the jury commissioner would solve the problem. Now, as Tijerina later described, he returned as he was instructed to, only to be informed by the judge that the jury commissioner had identified exactly 2 potential Mexican-American jurors to hear the case. Unfortunately, one of those 2 was deceased and therefore obviously unable to serve, and the other was not a citizen and therefore disqualified from serving on a jury. As he described the situation later, Tijerina explained that he had to settle his client's case for literally pennies on the dollar of what she would have received, he believed, had she gotten a fair shake in the court system. This event, this experience, he described as inspiring him to put together the group of activists and lawyers from across the country to create what would become MALDEF. Interestingly, 50 years later, as we commemorated our half-century of existence 2 years ago, so many of the early leaders of MALDEF, unfortunately, Mr. Tijerina and another one of our early presidents and general counsels, Mario Obledo, had already passed away by our 50th anniversary. But to a person, the surviving early leaders, including our third president and general counsel, Ambassador Vilma Martinez, including some of our earliest board members, remarked when asked that when they began the endeavor, they assumed, they believed, that MALDEF would no longer be needed 50 years later. But to a person in 2018, they concluded that the need for MALDEF was even more pronounced in 2018 than it had been in 1968. And they supported the efforts that we were making to build the roadblocks to continue the service that we provide to the nation in years to come. Of course, you all are aware of what in 2018 might have caused them to conclude that the need for our services was as great as it had ever been. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But certainly, many things had changed in 50 years. When MALDEF was founded in 1968, one could fairly describe the Latino community in the United States as concentrated almost entirely in the southwestern states that were, until the mid-19th century, a part of Mexico, from California to Texas, with isolated pockets of Latino population outside of the Southwest in Chicago, Illinois, New York City, and South Florida. But it was very much a regional population at the time. It was also a much smaller population than it is today. I know many of you, had the opportunity to hear one of our leading scholars, Luis Fraga, a few weeks ago, and you know then that certainly the demography of the Latino population in the United States has changed dramatically in the 52 years since MALDEF was founded. We are no longer a regional community. There are now significant Latino populations in every region of the United States and in virtually every state. We have been the largest minority group in the United States, according to the United States Census, since 2003. For 17 years, we have been the largest minority group in the United States. Or as one of my colleagues who leads another Latino civil rights organization would prefer that we characterize it, Latinos have been the second largest racial ethnic group in the country since 2003. But we are also, as many of you are aware, a rapidly growing population. And a measure of the increasing significance of Latinos to the success of the United States in the future is in the following statistic. Today, more than 1 in 4 of all public school students from kindergarten through 12th grade nationwide in the United States is Latino. Greater than 1 in 4. And that is, of course, a measure of who is the future workforce and leadership of our country. It's also true that our two most populous states, California and Texas, which in many ways are leading the demographic future the entire country, currently each of those two most populous states has a population that is 40% Latino. The state of New Mexico, between the two, actually has a population that is even higher in its Latino percentage. So it is quite clear that the population has grown. The civil rights challenges that we face have also grown together with that population. Indeed, for many, the growth of the Latino population has been an occasion not of celebration, an occasion not of remark alone, but has catalyzed fears in many portions of the broader national population. This demographic fear, a concern at bottom that the growth of the Latino community will somehow dramatically change the nature and the culture of the United States, has in the last 25 years, unfortunately catalyzed significant changes in policy and rhetoric that have targeted the Latino population. This has been by political leaders who have chosen to exploit those demographic fears rather than to responsibly seek to address them. I want to be clear. I think that there are reasons for demographic fears that are not grounded in racism or intolerance. At bottom, for many, demographic fear is about fear of change writ large. And whether that change comes in the form of a growing Latino population or in the form of expanding technology, change is simply something that is full of fear for many people. In addition, there's an amount of nostalgia that goes into these demographic fears, a concern that a grandparent's experience growing up in the United States will be dramatically different from that of a grandchild. Certainly, there are some who ascribe to these demographic fears and exploit them, whose views are grounded in an ideology of white supremacy and white nationalism. But for many, there is no such source. It is grounded more in what I have described previously. Nonetheless, there have been political leaders who have, on more than one occasion, chosen to exploit those fears, deepen them, exacerbate them through lack of leadership. For example, here in my home state of California, now 26 years ago, we saw the enactment of Proposition 187 in November of 1994. Now, this was a measure that was championed by our then Governor Pete Wilson, who was seeking to exploit those demographic fears, particularly of the growth of the Latino community, by championing a measure targeting the undocumented Latino population. Proposition 187, for those who don't recall, because it received national attention, sought to require any person seeking government services to prove that they had legal status, citizenship, or lawful permanent residence in the United States, and would have required public servants from our schools to our hospitals to inquire about status, and if they reasonably suspected someone of being undocumented, to deny services and report the suspected individual to the government, both immigration authorities in Washington and state authorities in Sacramento. That's an example of what MALDEF has faced and challenged in court. Indeed, one of our most famous victories was to join with others in successfully preventing Proposition 187, which had been enacted by 58% of California voters in 1994, but to successfully prevent it from ever being implemented. I mentioned Proposition 187 because some of you may have had or will have occasion to see a recently released documentary on PBS about Proposition 187 and its connection to the Latino vote, and specifically how it inspired a change in the state of California. My tenure at MALDEF as president and general counsel began in 2000, and only a year after that, in 2010, we saw a recurrence in many ways of what occurred with Proposition 187 in the neighboring state of Arizona. Not through a ballot measure, but through a Senate bill, SB 1070, Arizona was thrown into tumult as a result of the enactment of a law that would have required law enforcement in Arizona to determine if they had a suspicion that anyone they interacted with in the course of pursuing their duties, if they had a suspicion that that person was undocumented, they had a requirement to detain and report that person to immigration authorities. SB 1070 sought, among other measures, to deputize every law enforcement agent at every locality in the state of Arizona to enforce immigration laws. The measure came out in an era of concern in Arizona, sparked in part by the now infamous Sheriff Joe Arpaio, who had already made it a mission of his law enforcement force in Maricopa County, where Phoenix is located, made it a mission of his law enforcement force to regularly enforce immigration laws, even after it was by a United States District Court judge that campaign was largely built on unconstitutional racial profiling. So MALDEF too has challenged SB 1070 together with others, with some success as the case went to the US Supreme Court, and a majority of that court struck down significant portions of the law, though unfortunately leaving in place that obligation, although it was limited by judicial construction, to act upon suspicions that those law enforcement came into contact with were undocumented. I mentioned those two before I get to today as some examples of MALDEF's work. Our mission over our 52 years has been to promote the civil rights of all Latinos living in the United States. As I mentioned, we were founded on the model of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and indeed we see LDF as in many ways an important godparent of MALDEF. It was then Director Counsel of LDF, Jack Greenberg, who connected our founders to the Ford Foundation, a funder of LDF itself. And it was the Ford Foundation whose financial support enabled us to open our doors in San Antonio and Los Angeles in August of 1968. As I mentioned, the demography of the Latino community has changed, but we continue to grapple with some of the issues we have struggled with over the course of our existence. If I was to characterize that struggle, it would be to shape our legal system to respond to a different but related experience of discrimination as felt in the Latino community. As you all know, most of our civil rights laws were framed very much in a black-white context, growing out of national concerns sparked by a civil rights movement about Jim Crow practices and laws in the South, then extending beyond the South with a recognition that many of those practices, though not formalized, were still occurring and still affecting the livelihoods of many people throughout the United States. But those laws, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and even the Voting Rights Act of 1965, were framed very much in a black-white context. So the Latino community and MALDEF has struggled over our history to ensure that those laws that were adopted for that black-white context are applicable in the related but not entirely identical circumstances of experiences of discrimination in the Latino community. Let me pause for a moment to explain that history extends well back in our country's history to even before MALDEF was founded. I hope many of you are familiar with the case of Hernandez versus Texas, which is the first major Latino civil rights case decided by the US Supreme Court. Coincidentally, it was decided in the exact same month as Brown versus Board of Education, May of 1954. Hernandez versus Texas, coincidentally, given the story of MALDEF's founding that I provided you from Pete Tijerina, Hernandez versus Texas also involved jury exclusion and the then prevailing practice that continued despite the Hernandez versus Texas decision, as I mentioned, but the then prevailing practice of not permitting any non-white, including Latino, juror to sit on a criminal or civil jury in Texas. Hernandez versus Texas came to the US Supreme Court because the state of Texas had decided that a precedent set in 1936 in Norris versus Alabama, applicable to the African American community, should not apply to Latinos in the state of Texas. In Norris versus Alabama, the US Supreme Court concluded that if a litigant, criminal defendant, were able to show a long-standing pattern of no African Americans serving on juries, that would suffice to demonstrate a prima facie case of unconstitutional jury exclusion. You did not have to prove intentional discrimination through any smoking gun statements from a jury commissioner or anyone else. Simply the pattern of long-term exclusion was enough. That important Norris versus Alabama case, which, as you all can understand, took many years to be implemented. But in the state of Texas, the state chose to deny that precedent to Latinos, and it did so through the following legerdemain. The state of Texas concluded that Latinos were white and therefore could not claim, like the litigants in Norris versus Alabama, that their race had a pattern of exclusion, even though, of course, no Latino had ever served on a jury. The state of Texas argued, but white people, and Latinos are white people, serve on juries. So in the case of Hernandez, Mr. Hernandez cannot claim that his race has been excluded and cannot rely on any pattern of Latino exclusion because it is not his race. His race is white, and white jurors are allowed. Now, fortunately, a unanimous Supreme Court, same unanimous Supreme Court that in the same month decided Brown, concluded that the state of Texas could not get away with that subterfuge. It concluded if you treat a group like a different race, and there was ample evidence, including, most infamously, a label on the very courthouse where the case was being heard, where Hernandez versus Texas was being heard, there were bathrooms that were segregated. And over the bathroom set aside for African Americans was also a sign that said hombres aquí, or men here in Spanish. There was ample indication that Latinos, Mexican Americans were treated differently, like a different race in Texas. And so the Supreme Court unanimously concluded that it could not attempt to deprive the Latino community of using that African American precedent in Norris versus Alabama to challenge jury exclusion. But that is an example of laws and doctrine that were developed in a positive way for the African American community to challenge civil rights violations, where the Latino community has had to struggle in the legal system to ensure that those precedents can also apply to them. For example, we regularly see and have seen throughout our history that discrimination against Latinos is often justified as not being discrimination on the basis of race, but being discrimination on the basis of some proxy for race, such as immigration status. We're not discriminating against Latinos per se, only against those who are immigrants or undocumented immigrants. Or often it's based on language or accent. We're not discriminating on the basis of race. We're discriminating because you can't speak English or because you speak English with an accent. Or sometimes the proxy may be even more obvious, based on something like appearance, based on something like being close in proximity to the border, and coupled with that, appearing to be Latino. This idea of discrimination by proxy is one that MALDEF has struggled with throughout its existence. I do want to address what we see occurring today, but one more example of having to struggle to ensure that protections derived in a black-white context could also apply to discrimination faced by Latinos is in one of those laws that I mentioned, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which has been justly identified by many as perhaps the most effective and impactful civil rights legislation ever enacted and implemented in this country. Indeed, many of you are aware of the recent passing of John Lewis, who had his beginnings as an activist fighting for the right to vote in the South on behalf of the African American community, and later served as an inspiring leader in our Congress. Passed away this year, and part of the commemoration of his passing was a recognition of the importance of the Voting Rights Act. But even when we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act some 5 years ago, he was not widely recognized or remarked. And when it was originally enacted by the Congress in 1965, the Voting Rights Act did not protect Latinos, Mexican Americans in the southwestern United States. There were provisions in the original act that specifically applied to Puerto Rican voters, primarily in the Northeast. But the protections of the Voting Rights Act did not extend to Latinos, Mexican Americans experiencing exclusion, not just in juries, but from voting booths throughout the southwestern United States, could not call upon the protections of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 for 10 years. We were left to rely upon, and this included, of course, the initial years of MALDEF's existence, but we were left to rely upon the Constitution and its protections of the right to vote, which are limited and could not call upon the Voting Rights Act itself. It was only with the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act in 1975 that those protections were extended to the Latino community in the Southwest. Now, it's important to note that that was a struggle in which MALDEF participated as a leader, trying to convince the civil rights community. Civil rights supporters, both black and white, had serious concerns about expanding the Voting Rights Act in 1975 to protect Latinos because they were concerned that opening up the process in that way could lead to further restrictions on the protections that the Voting Rights Act provided to the African American community. So MALDEF had to lead a battle with some of its allies then and certainly today in the civil rights community to expand the Civil Rights Act to protect the Voting Rights Act to protect Latinos as well as African Americans. Now, MALDEF pursues its mission through the courts in litigation, through policy advocacy, through community education, and through communications and media. And we concentrate our work, at least for the last 25 years, in the areas of education, employment, immigrant rights, and voting rights. We have chosen through our board these concentrated areas because we believe that they are foundational for success in so many other endeavors, and out of a concern that we ensure that our expertise and our limited resources are concentrated where they can have the greatest impact. I promise to talk about today. I mentioned at the beginning that our leaders from the beginning, many of them responsible for the success that I've described, for example, in expanding the Voting Rights Act, remarked that there was as much or greater a need for our work today than ever in the past, including at our founding. The basis for that, of course, is that we have lived in the last 4 years through what is, I think, quite clearly the most openly anti-Latino and anti-immigrant presidential administration in our entire nation's history. You are all familiar with this, but I will remind us that when Donald Trump launched his campaign for president in June of 2015, he did so with a slander directed at all Mexican immigrants, characterizing them as rapists and killers, and acknowledging only that some of them were likely to be good people. You may also recall that a year later, he doubled down on that strategy of targeting the Latino community by accusing a sitting federal judge of being biased against him simply because that judge is Mexican American. And of course, when he took office in January of 2017, he began his tenure with a series of executive orders challenging immigrants, demonizing them, and characterizing them all as criminals. We have seen an unending barrage, I believe, in 4 years from this administration of statements and rhetoric that target the Latino community, with, I believe, detrimental effects on the Latino community nationwide, including, unfortunately, inspiring what is now the deadliest bias-motivated attack on Latinos in our history in El Paso, Texas, in August of 2019. In addition, we have seen a level of exclusion under this administration for the Latino community that is unprecedented in decades. There currently is not a single Latino or Latina sitting in the cabinet of the United States. That is as a result of the resignation some time ago of Labor Secretary Alex Acosta, who was replaced by Eugene Scalia, meaning no Latinos in the cabinet. You would have to go back more than 3 decades. If you define the issue as exclusion of Latinos from the cabinet, you would have to go back more than 3 decades. If you define the issue instead as the exclusion of the largest minority group in the country from the cabinet of the United States, you would have to go back even farther. It's also true that this administration, despite record-setting appointments and confirmations of judges to our federal courts nationwide, has in its 4 years nominated only one Latino or Latina to sit on any court of appeals in the entire country. One. on any court of appeals in the entire country, with the end result that the Fifth Circuit, for example, which is dominated by the state of Texas with its 40% Latino population, the Fifth Circuit today has not a single active Latino or Latina judge sitting in the Fifth Circuit, on the Fifth Circuit. It's that level of exclusion coupled with policies and rhetoric that target the Latino population that has challenged MALDEF in our work. We have had to continue to engage in challenges around immigrants' rights, in challenges around employment rights, in challenges around education, and in particular in challenges around voting rights. I will give an example of the last as I conclude. A year ago, MALDEF had to challenge an attempt by the state of Texas, inspired by rhetoric that accuses immigrant Latinos of widespread voter fraud, that rhetoric emanating from Donald Trump himself in the aftermath of his losing the popular vote in 2016. You will recall that he made allegations of widespread voter fraud and more or less openly asserted that that fraud was in the immigrant community. Inspired by that rhetoric, the state of Texas a year ago sought to remove 100,000 voters from its voter rolls. It did so by targeting individuals who had indicated to the Department of Motor Vehicles in Texas, when they initially received a driver's license, that they were not citizens. Of course, those recipients of driver's licenses, even when they naturalized and became citizens, had no obligation or any particular reason to inform the Department of Motor Vehicles that they had become citizens, because it's not relevant to the right to receive a driver's license. So they had not. But the state of Texas took those records and then accused those 100,000, most of them now naturalized, the vast majority of them now naturalized, but accused those 100,000 voters of not being eligible to vote. MALDEF and others had to sue the state when it became quite clear that the state knew that its records from the DMV were not accurate reflections of current citizenship status. The case was rather quickly resolved to prevent the removal of those 100,000 voters. There are other threats, but I would cite that one as an indication of how the rhetoric of these 4 years has had a real impact on voting rights. It has had a similar impact on the other areas where we work. So we face continued challenges at MALDEF. I believe we face them with a great deal of skill and expertise. We face them with a great deal of passion exhibited by all of my staff members nationwide. We are a staff of just over 55 people. Some 24, 25 of those are lawyers. But we have an impact, I believe, beyond those numbers because of the expertise, because of the passion that we bring to our work. We still have challenges ahead, and we look forward to meeting you as we look to a future where the Latino population continues to grow, but where more responsible leadership will not seek to exploit demographic fears, but will seek to responsibly address those fears, recognizing that majority Latino cities, like the city of Los Angeles, where I sit today, like the city of El Paso, are quintessentially American cities, even though they are now majority Latino in population. But we look forward to an era of more responsible leadership with respect to demography and demographic fear, and we look forward to continuing with great success to protect and promote the civil rights of all Latinos living in the United States. With that, Greg, I'm very happy to answer any and all questions to the best extent of my ability.
Thank you very much, Tom. That was like your leadership, an inspiring talk, and it has helped to not only confirm the legacy that you carry on at MALDEF, but it alerts us to the importance of your continued work. So anybody who wants to help MALDEF, it's not hard to find by Googling MALDEF and get in touch with Tom or anybody at the organization there in any way that you feel is appropriate to help out. So we do have some questions. Tom, the first relates to DACA. And the question is, can you please provide a summary of MALDEF's efforts with regard to DACA, and where do you see that ending up potentially in a new administration?
Thank you. I appreciate the question. So throughout our history, MALDEF has always championed the rights of undocumented immigrants, and in particular of undocumented children. One of our most famous cases is the case of Plyler versus Doe, which went to the United States Supreme Court in 1982 out of Texas. As I say to many audiences, so many of these cases come out of Texas. But in the late 1970s, the state of Texas sought to exclude undocumented children from public schools or to charge them tuition, which would have the same practical effect of excluding them. The case of Plyler versus Doe went to the US Supreme Court, where MALDEF represented the plaintiffs, and the majority of the Supreme Court concluded in Plyler that there is an equal protection right of every child, regardless of immigration status, to attend free public school from kindergarten through 12th grade. The so-called dreamers are Plyler kids. These are kids who are undocumented, go to our public schools, and then go on to attempt to continue their education in college or university. The dreamers are the recipients of DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, an initiative that was put in place in 2012 by then President Obama as an exercise of his executive authority to exercise prosecutorial discretion with respect to those DACA recipients. They are a portion of the larger undocumented population, and what President Obama, through his administration, announced in DACA was that these were not enforcement priorities, would be provided if they came forward and qualified work authorization, and we would be provided with deferred action, meaning that there would be no attempt to deport or remove them for a 2-year period, renewable with a subsequent application and submission of another fee to receive DACA and work authorization. MALDEF has been a champion of providing permanent legislative relief to this class of immigrants. We are among the initial drafters of the so-called DREAM Act, which has been introduced in the Congress repeatedly over well over a decade. And that DREAM Act would provide a long-term path to legalization and citizenship for those who are currently receiving DACA, namely those who are brought to the United States without status when they are minors. DACA has been under legal challenge since virtually its beginning. It was initially challenged in a case that MALDEF attempted to intervene, and then when denied intervention, participated as amicus. It was initially challenged by those who work for ICE, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Service, but that challenge to DACA was dismissed by federal court for a lack of standing. But in 2014, when President Obama sought to expand DACA and to further introduce a new initiative called DAPA, Deferred Action for Parents of Americans, which would have applied to those who are undocumented but who have United States citizen children, it was challenged in court by the state of Texas and several others. MALDEF did intervene in that case and represented, together with the Obama administration, the defenders of DAPA and expanded DACA as it went to the US Supreme Court. In 2016, unfortunately, we had an 8-justice court because of the death of Antonin Scalia and the refusal of the Senate to consider Merrick Garland, President Obama's nominee, for that vacancy. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court reached a split 4-4 decision. And that meant the Fifth Circuit's decision would remain in place, and the Fifth Circuit had upheld a decision by a district court judge that DAPA and expanded DACA were not lawful. So those initiatives were never implemented. DACA, the original from 2012, remained in place. As many of you are aware, the Trump administration announced early in its existence an intention to end DACA. A number of cases were brought around the country to prevent the ending of DACA, and those cases have succeeded most recently in a Supreme Court decision this year in preventing the administration from ending the provision of deferred action for childhood arrivals to those who had previously received it. The administration did successfully end the consideration of new applications, but it has not been able to prevent renewals from continuing. MALDEF's role in this more recent round of litigation has been to intervene in another case filed by Texas, this one still pending and seeking to outlaw the original 2012 DACA initiative. So we are currently still in discovery disputes leading to a potential resolution of that Texas challenge to the legality of DACA. We have also continued to work in the legislature to convince bipartisan support to expand for enacting the DREAM Act. Finally, we currently have pending litigation that challenges the recent attempt by the Department of Homeland Security through its acting secretary, Chad Wolf, to change the renewal period for DACA recipients from 2 years to 1 year, with the same exact fee charged to them, with the same danger that a renewal would not be timely and they could be denied work authorization and have to be fired by their employers. So we are currently in litigation challenging that change in DACA from 2-year term to 1-year term on the basis that Chad Wolf is not entitled to serve as acting secretary under the Federal Vacancies Reform Act and the Succession Act in place as it applies to the Department of Homeland Security. Where will this end up if there's a new administration? It's certainly our hope that DACA would be expanded to its original 2 years and a new administration would agree to continue to take new applications as well as renewals. But ultimately, of course, our hope is that as in the past, there will be bipartisan support for a DREAM Act, a legislated solution that will provide a pathway to citizenship and long-term work authorization, legalization for this population of undocumented immigrants who were brought here as minors. So I believe and hope that those bipartisan majorities will again emerge and provide a pathway, finally, with a new Congress in 2021 to address permanently relief for these immigrants.
Thank you, Tom. I share your optimism. We have a question regarding threats of voter intimidation. And the question is, what can lawyers do to help voters of all parties to vote in a manner that is not interfered with? And what is MALDEF doing in anticipation of what many predict to be voter intimidation during this next election?
Thank you. It's a great question. I and many are very concerned about voter intimidation or attempts at voter intimidation that may occur with this election. That intimidation may take different forms, particularly for those who vote remotely. It may take the form of disinformation about what it takes to successfully cast a ballot by mail. And so we are gearing up to respond to any disinformation that is apparent in tweets, in Facebook posts, in whatever media, to provide accurate information to counter that misinformation, disinformation. The prospect of in-person voter intimidation at polling places is perhaps even more troubling, because that intimidation may take the form of uniformed individuals or even armed individuals showing up at or near polling places, particularly in largely African American or Latino communities. This is a matter of great concern. And certainly MALDEF, together with a coalition of 12 nonprofit organizations, including LDF, including the ACLU, including the Brennan Center and the Lawyers Committee, but 12 organizations, the main nonprofits that pursue voting rights litigation across the country, are together in a working group consortium, and we are regularly talking about our preparations to respond to voter intimidation, which may include needing to contact authorities to intervene, and if that's not successful, going to court to enjoin continued activity that is unlawful seeking to deter participation in the vote. What can lawyers do? I tell lawyers that we are, of course, all of us, trusted voices in our communities. So what lawyers can do is to reassure everyone that they have the right to vote, to ensure that they have correct information and are not responding to disinformation. But beyond that, to embolden them to understand they have the right to vote. And if they see someone who's uniformed or armed at a polling place, that should not deter them from casting their ballot. That reassuring voice is invaluable in my view in this upcoming election. But beyond that, for those who have time, MALDEF, together with many others, including the Lawyers Committee, as I've mentioned, which runs a nationwide election protection hotline, but all of the many organizations I've described and others, we are always looking for those who are ready to participate in any necessary litigation on election day involving intimidation or other attempts to deter participation by those who have every right to cast a vote. So if you have the time and inclination, I urge you to become involved in one of those election protection volunteer networks. But even if you don't have the time, please be a reassuring, confident voice to those who may have fears and concerns about casting a ballot that they have every right to cast.
Thank you, Tom. Just a very quick story about my family. As you know, my family name is Hinojosa, and my grandfather, Frank Poncho Hinojosa, came from Mexico, studied for, and became a U.S. citizen. And their proudest, my grandparents, who were both married for over 50 years, Frank and Carmen Hinojosa, their proudest day, my grandfather would wear the suit that he wore to his wedding. It didn't fit as well, but he put it on, and he would wear it to the voting booth. He would wear it to Glassell Park Elementary School in Los Angeles, where he was so proud to be an American and so proud to vote. Thank you for all you're doing for people like my grandparents and people who are recent immigrants to the United States who have a right to vote, to ensure that they are able to exercise that right, Tom.
Thank you, Greg. What we will see in this election is that the Latino community will come out, as it has repeatedly, and have, I believe, a decisive impact on many critical races across the country, particularly in the states where Latino vote is so significant. I think that we, despite the pandemic, will see high rates of turnout in the Latino and other communities, and that will have a decisive impact on the outcome of many of the very important candidacies and issues on ballots around the country.
Thank you, Tom. Let's move to the next question. On ICE and separation at the border, could you comment, Tom, on what's going on most currently and what MALDEF's plans are related to that continued abuse?
So separation of families at the border, and even more broadly, the way we have changed how we address refugees, asylees who approach our southern border is a matter of great concern, and one that I hope will receive great attention next year as hopefully reforms can be put in place. But family separation and its corollary, which is the detention of children and families long-term often in our immigration detention facilities, is a great matter of concern. We certainly have been concerned more recently about how detention in the context of a pandemic can have an effect on those who are most vulnerable to long-term and harm and even death. And we have stepped in those circumstances. We have worked regularly in Washington to attempt to further ensure that any child detention is brief, and that detention, when it occurs, is provided with as much humanity as is possible, including ensuring that there is education provided to these children. Separation, which became particularly pronounced and got great attention under this administration, is an important issue of concern. But I want to emphasize that the longer term issues of child detention and family detention, which predated even this administration, are ones that we should be concerned about and that MALDEF is concerned about ensuring we reform as quickly as possible in the new year with a new Congress in place. The fact is that our practices, whether it's separation or detention, and in particular, the specific conditions faced by detainees across the board, is really not consistent with our national principles and our national beliefs. And it's only when they get the attention that they did, that family separation in particular received from the media, that we get a focus on the fact that we have so many practices in this area that do not reflect our abiding constitutional and other principles as a people. And it is my hope that we can begin to address some of the most egregious of these issues very quickly in early 2021. And top of that list certainly would be our practices with respect to families and children who approach our country as refugees, meaning that they are fleeing very dire and very threatening circumstances in their home countries. We have unfortunately seen a wholesale change in our asylum practices, all driven by concerns about Central American refugees, and that needs to end. We need to arrive at a better, more humane practice with respect to refugees from the Western Hemisphere. And if I could just say, that has been the long-term problem. We don't treat refugees from this hemisphere in the way that we treat refugees from the other hemisphere. And that's the long-standing problem that has been, unfortunately, very, very broadly and dangerously exacerbated, that initial problem under this administration. So we need to arrive at a more humane and fair way of addressing refugee flows to our southern border that emanate from the Western Hemisphere.
Thank you, Tom. We're going to wrap up with just a couple more questions. One regarding the preservation of Hispanic or Latino culture. And the question is, how do efforts to preserve culture within the Hispanic and Latinx community, understanding that there are differences, but generally as a whole, how do those efforts to preserve that culture perpetuate discrimination?
It's an interesting question. I think that unfortunately certain cultures have been treated differently than others in our national history and our continuing history. So that efforts to ensure that cultures are melding into the United States overall culture are welcomed in some circumstances and feared in others. Too often, I think the Latino community, perhaps because of the size of the community and the growth of the community, but certainly also grounded in the fact that interactions between the United States and the Latino community historically developed in very biased circumstances. I can explain that, but in any event, that has long-term consequences, just as we recognize that practices from the distant past still have ramifications for how we deal with certain groups and cultures, certainly true for Latinos. So unfortunately, that means that issues like attempts to preserve language or to preserve cultural practices are often viewed hostilely in the United States, particularly in portions of the country where there may not be a history of those cultures being well represented. So that is certainly a concern. I think it is all grounded, though, as I said, in this demographic fear coupled with the historical development in our initial interactions, the historical development of the introduction of large numbers of Latinos to the United States. By which I mean to say that the introductions of large numbers of Latinos to the United States began first with the war in the mid-19th century between the United States and Mexico. But what folks don't recall is that in order to justify a war, which was a war to take over a country, our leadership nationally had to come up with a justification. And that justification turned out to be grounded in racist notions about who lived in Mexico. So that the war to take over Mexico was basically justified to take the country away from a backward race. So oftentimes the rhetoric involved emphasizing that Mexicans were largely Native American in racial background. So this was viewed as akin with the genocide against Native Americans in the United States. And in other ways, the Mexicans were described as a race, a mixed race of Native American and European, that because of that mixed race nature could not be trusted to responsibly govern all of that land. So these racist notions were perpetuated at the national level, just as a result of the war, large numbers of Latinos were for the first time introduced to the population of the United States. And I say large numbers because Latinos have been present in the United States from its very beginning, as you know, Greg, but this is the first introduction of large numbers when the Southwestern United States is taken over and those who reside there who are Mexican become residents of the United States. Similar rhetoric is used later on, a half century later, to justify, for example, taking over the island of Puerto Rico. So again, if you're a country like the United States with its constitutional principles, you need to have a reason to justify taking over a land that's ruled by other people. And too often that has the mechanism used to justify it was frankly racist stereotypings about the population there. And that's done at a national level, and the whole intent is to have it really penetrate throughout the population. And so when you have a population that's introduced in large numbers through that context, that has long-term consequences with how culture is then perceived from those people longer term throughout the history of the United States. So I think it's important for us to be reminded of that history, which to some may seem a long time ago, but I think we now understand that how cultures begin to interact has long-term consequences because they really are passed on from generation to generation.
Thank you, Tom. Not only are you an amazing civil rights lawyer, but you also are a historian. I can tell you've read up a lot more than many of us, and that was very helpful to put into context some of the cultural issues that we face today in attempting to preserve our culture. I'm reminded of something that Cesar Chavez said. You may know the quote that preservation of our own culture doesn't require contempt or disrespect for other cultures. And this is certainly something to keep in mind as we deal with so much of our contemporary discussions and objections and protests, peaceful protests for the most part. So we're going to have to...
That perspective, Greg, is really shared within the Latino community. You know, I certainly know that I have benefited greatly from the other cultures that are present in the community that I grew up in. And even more so as I expanded my horizon going on to college and the like, I've benefited from all of the cultures that have contributed to the greater growth of the United States. And I think Latinos recognize that in general.
Okay, so thank you, Tom. We've got one more question that I'm going to just push on with because I think it's very important to many of the folks from the business community and legal community that are listening today, and then we'll wrap up very quickly here. The question is from Art, and the question is, how can large national firms better partner with MALDEF and similar organizations to advance civil and legal rights of Latinos in the United States?
Thank you. It's a great question, and I think there are many ways, and they start with events like this. I think this is a terrific opportunity for McGuire Woods to partner with MALDEF to learn together. And I always try to encourage more of this kind of interaction. It's valuable on both sides. But certainly, we often in our colleague organizations representing the Latino community and other communities are always looking for pro bono assistance, and where firms can work with us in litigation. It's often, I think, very valuable, certainly on MALDEF's end, and I believe, as I've heard from those who've done it, certainly valuable on the large firm end as well. Certainly, we look for not just litigation pro bono assistance, but MALDEF is also a corporate entity, and we look for the kind of pro bono assistance and advice on our human relations practices, advice on our corporate practices as a nonprofit, advice on our security practices, cybersecurity and other. MALDEF also owns a building here in Los Angeles where our headquarters is, and we always look for pro bono advice on being a landlord and running a building. And it's an old building built in 1929, so even with respect to historic preservation, we look for pro bono advice. So I want to convey that the areas that we look for pro bono assistance are not just the ones you might immediately think of co-counseling in an important case, though that is certainly very much valuable. We also look for pro bono involvement in being a part of our board. Greg, you're part of a subsidiary board, the subsidiary that owns this very building that I mentioned, the MALDEF Property Management Corporation, and I valued that, and I hope you've gained from it. But we look for that kind of involvement as well. Service on a scholarship committee. We give out law school scholarships. That was something that the Ford Foundation asked us to do from the very beginning, to build the pipeline of future lawyers serving the Latino community. We continue to do that. And we have a scholarship committee to help us make those choices, as well as to raise money for the scholarships. And then, of course, we have, in years that are not pronounced by a pandemic as this one, we have events, in-person events throughout the country, but in particular where we have regional offices, which is Los Angeles, San Antonio, Texas, Chicago, Illinois, and Washington, D.C. We have in-person events annually in each of those places. We look for folks to help us at those fundraising events, serving on our committee, and certainly attending, and certainly bringing a table of folks who can support our work. But there are a whole set of ways that we look to always work with large law firms and large corporate entities as well.
Thank you, Tom. So at this point, we will go ahead and conclude our presentation for the day with gratitude and with recognition, Tom, for your service to the Latino, Hispanic community, to the children and families of the community. We're grateful for your presence today, for your service to America, and your fight to make America a more equal, just country. Thank you, Tom Saenz, and thank you all for joining us. We're grateful. Have a good afternoon.